We could grab a seat. We're going to get started. We're running a couple of minutes behind. I'll say a few words and then I'll just go to you. Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ashley Freiburger. I'm the Associate Director of Government Affairs with J Street, so thank you all so much for taking the time. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator, Debra, and then she's going to take it away with the panel. So to my right here, I have Dr. Deborah Shushan. She's the Director of Policy and Government Relations at Americans for Peace Now. She's responsible for formulating APN's policy positions and directs their relations with Congress. And Debra, I'm going to let you say a few words about yourself and then take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. It feels always being here like a homecoming. And I feel very privileged to be with this wonderful panel today. I want to greet all of them, greet all of you, greet the folks who are not in the room, who are watching us on live stream. We have what I think is a very important panel here today on the scorched earth policies of the Trump administration, which we want to unpack and understand. And equally, I think, if not more important, is looking ahead to what might come next after the 2020 elections, whether it will be another 4 years of Trump. It could happen. Especially if we don't, or a new administration, right? And what the next administration would need to do in order to try to reverse some of the policies that we've seen by the Trump administration and take us to another place, a much better place. So what I'd like to do before I introduce the panelists is to give a bit of framing. And in doing that, I'd like to talk a little bit about these policies of the Trump administration. What do we mean when we say this is scorched earth? After all, we have a succession of presidents before Trump who failed to reverse the occupation, to halt settlements, right? This is a problem that certainly far pre-existed the Trump administration. However, what I would certainly argue is that the Trump administration has pursued a revolutionary foreign policy on Israel-Palestine that has created in a short time far greater damage than we have seen previously under previous U.S. administrations. So I'm going to just regale you for a moment because I think it's worth refreshing what's happened over the past few years in terms of some of the revolutionary actions of the Trump administration. First, we have from the get-go the fact that President Trump, unlike successive administrations, Republican and Democrat, that came before him in the past couple of decades, refused to commit to continuing the U.S. policy in favor of a two-state solution. One state, two states, whatever the parties like, is what he would stand for. Then, of course, we have the dramatic actions of the Trump administration regarding Jerusalem, the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital outside the framework of an agreed peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and of course, the moving of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem under the auspices of Ambassador David Friedman. Please, feel free. Feel free. Bring it on. All right. Bring it on. Then we have a slashing of aid to the Palestinians. Now, we should remember, right, that this is not only something that the Trump administration took to the extreme, but also something that Congress did in large part and set up the Trump administration to kind of finish off the job. So it wasn't only the administration there. We have the attacks on UNRWA, the UN body responsible for taking care of basic needs of Palestinian refugees, and trying to not only to basically follow up the taking of the Jerusalem issue off the table by taking the issue of Palestinian refugees off the table as well. We have the closure of the PLO mission in DC, and if that weren't enough in terms of severing diplomatic relations between the US and the Palestinians, then we had the hostile takeover of the consulate in Jerusalem by Friedman's embassy. We had the recognition by the U.S. government of Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, a word that the Israeli government had not itself used regarding its extension of sovereignty to the Golan Heights. But here you have the administration full-throatedly endorsing this policy of annexation, de facto annexation of the Golan Heights, articulating a new doctrine, which basically said that international law would not apply, international law against annexation of occupied territory, if the war that had been fought was one of self-defense. This is a totally innovative argument that has been pursued by the U.S. and Israeli administrations. Very creative, I must say. You have the complete denial of the existence of occupation with, under Friedman's direction, the State Department excising the word occupation and the word occupied from State Department human rights reports. You have Jason Greenblatt, Trump's peace envoy, so-called, declaring that settlements are just neighborhoods and cities in the West Bank. They're not settlements anymore. You have Friedman giving an interview to the New York Times in which he stated that Israel has, quote, the right to retain parts of the West Bank. And then you have right-wing Israeli politicians following up and citing the Trump administration's position as a reason that Israel must annex at least portions of the West Bank now. And of course, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu claiming that he has been working with the Trump administration on annexation plans. Ambassador Friedman has stated very clearly that this administration has an intention of irreversibility of its policies toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it wants to capitalize on this scorched earth to make sure that no future administration can repair what we would see, certainly, as damage to the cause of Israeli-Palestinian peace. At the AIPAC Annual Policy Conference earlier this year, Ambassador Friedman stated, can we run the risk that one day the government of Israel will lament, why didn't we make more progress when U.S. foreign policy was in the hands of President Trump, Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Bolton, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, and even David Friedman? How can we do that? The answer is we can't. We will continue to pursue peace because we believe we can be trusted to have the correct perspective and approach. The Trump administration and the Trump administration only. So today we'll use the time that we have to assess the scale of the damage and how much worse it could get and how reversible this damage is. And we'll ask the question, of course, what can the next administration do in order to repair and to move forward? So what I'd like to do next is to introduce this excellent panel sitting next to me. I will start with Danny Seidemann, who's sitting immediately to my right. Danny has lived in Jerusalem since 1973 and has specialized in the geopolitics of contemporary Jerusalem and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the city since 1991. Danny is a founder of Terrestrial Jerusalem and is frequently consulted by senior decision makers and governmental bodies on matters pertaining to both unfolding developments in Jerusalem and the broader issues relating to a permanent status agreement. He has been a member of the Israeli Bar Association since 1987, and a beautiful little detail here, in 2010, Queen Elizabeth II awarded him the title of honorary member of the Order of the British Empire for his expertise and advocacy regarding the Jerusalem issue. Seated immediately to his right is Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. She is a public opinion expert and political consultant. She has advised 7 national campaigns in Israel, in addition to electoral campaigns and political advising in 15 other countries. Dahlia conducts extensive research and policy analysis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, democracy, human and civil rights, minorities, and religion. She holds a PhD in political science from Tel Aviv University, and she is a founder and columnist at 972 magazine, which I'm sure many of you read. She is a policy fellow at Mitvim, the progressive Israeli think tank and Institute on Regional Foreign Policies, and she's a non-resident policy fellow at the Century Foundation. She also co-hosts the amazing Tel Aviv Review podcast, which if you don't already listen to, you must remedy that immediately. And to her right, we have Khaled Elgindy. He's an independent consultant and non-resident senior fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution. If you do not already own a copy of his book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, then shame on you. And go out and get it and read it immediately. Very important work that just came out with Brookings Institution Press in April 2019. Khaled previously served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel from 2004 to 2009. And he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations of 2007 to 2008. And to his right, anchoring our panel today, is Ilan Goldenberg, who is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Prior to joining CNAS, Ilan served as the chief of staff to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the U.S. State Department. And in that position, he played a key leadership role with the small team supporting Secretary Kerry's initiative to conduct permanent status peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you all so much for joining us. So the way that we will proceed today is that I'm going to ask one question of each of our panelists to begin the discussion here. If time looks like it's permitting, I may ask a question or two of the full panel. But I do want to make sure that we will have time for questions from the audience. I'm sure many of you have questions that you would like to ask our panelists. So I promise we will get to that. And when it's time to do that, I'll ask you to stand up behind the microphone. I should remind all of you when we get to the questioning stage to keep your questions brief and make sure that they begin with an interrogative word. Also, I would ask you all to silence cell phones and any technology as we get started here. Okay, Danny, I want to turn to you first. Many people are asking, we're asking even before the advent of the Trump administration, if the two-state solution was dead. And certainly after the first almost 3 years of the Trump administration, the movement toward not only creeping annexation, which has been happening for decades, but actual de jure annexation by the Israeli government. People are asking, is the two-state solution dead? Can it be revived? Danny, what's your take?
Well, thank you. Since this is defined as Trump and scorched earth, let's begin with Trump and his administration. I had the honor of taking Ambassador Friedman and Jason Greenblatt on a geopolitical tour of Jerusalem. I've done that with a number of people in this room. I was brought in to be a sledgehammer, to tell them in no uncertain terms what they would not be hearing from a lot of people around them. And I want to replicate what I told them as a way of answering your question. Along Route number 1, the old green line between East and West Jerusalem, I said to them, to our west are Israelis, to our right are not Israelis. They're Palestinians, because in 1967, Israel annexed the land of East Jerusalem. We did not annex the population. They are not citizens. They have no passports. They are not entitled to receive citizenship. They are politically disempowered permanently. That is a situation of occupation. Now, I agree with the former head of our Mossad, Tamir Pardo, that Israel confronts one existential threat in our generation. It is not the Iranian nuclear capability. We have responses to that. It's not 120,000 Hezbollah rockets. It is perpetual occupation. Israel cannot survive over time as a perpetually occupying power. Israel will end occupation, or occupation will be the end of us. So ending occupation is not only an existential. I did not get that round of applause from them. And I may say something that I know that some of you disagree with. Occupation ends one way. I know of no other way. I understand one thing, the mechanics of occupation. I've been working on it for 27 years. Occupation ends in a border, and that border goes here. And then I said to them, unless you understand that Israel's rule over East Jerusalem and the West Bank is occupation, and I'm not speaking as an ideologue or as an international lawyer, empirical reality, you will not understand this conflict. And if you don't understand this conflict, you will not be able to formulate policy. And any plan that you come up with based on false premises, you will be misleading the president, and you will fail. You're heading for a train wreck. They did not like it. And I did not succeed. Sometimes I have to describe what I do with this current situation in a 45-second elevator speech to a foreign minister. We're in a vehicle. There are no brakes, no steering wheel, traffic laws, international laws have been suspended. There is no destination, 2 states is gone, and the driver is an adolescent with a learner's permit and a personality disorder. That is what is working on the subject of Jerusalem like. Now, to the direct question, given the policies of the Trump administration, is the 2-state solution still possible? I don't know the answer to that. I can give you one definitive question and a number of additional questions, no definitive answers. There is a territorial dimension to this. The irreversibility of facts on the ground depends on answering one question. How many settlers will have to be relocated in order to get to a border that will be mutually acceptable under foreseeable circumstances to an Israeli leader and a Palestinian leader? Today, that number is on the order of 35,000 households, about 175,000 individuals. But before, and that has accelerated under Trump. But bear in mind, during the Obama administration, which completely overlapped with Netanyahu, the number went up by 10,000 households. There was a major problem with this issue before Trump arrived, and it's important not to do the blame game, because Trump leaves, we have not solved problems in and of itself, one. Number two, we are witnessing in Jerusalem something that has become a global phenomenon, and that is the weaponization of faith. There has been the religious groups in Jerusalem that are in the ascendancy are the biblically motivated settlers, the Temple Mount movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the end of days evangelicals like Pompeo and Pence, who make the settlers and the Brotherhood look tame. I can think of no other 2 people on the planet who less fit the description a person of faith than Trump and Netanyahu. Pious they're not, but both of their policies are being driven by end-of-days religion. And what we are witnessing is a morphing of a political conflict which ultimately can be resolved into a religious zero-sum conflict which cannot, and that too will survive the departure of Trump. One of the things that you described so well in the pronouncements of the Trump administration is basically, what is their thinking? And their thinking is, Israelis have rights, Palestinians have needs. Rights are inalienable, needs are a gift given by the magnanimous. Israelis have rights in Jerusalem, Palestinians have aspirations in Jerusalem. They do not recognize occupation because they don't recognize that it exists. It's not that they disagree with me. They don't know what I'm talking about. And your list, along with the others, sends a clear message. Israeli lives matter, Palestinian lives matter much less, and sometimes they don't matter at all. But I want to point out, and you did this brilliantly in your book, Khaled, that the notion that Israelis have domestic political concerns and Palestinians don't predated Trump and survived and was one of the major flaws in American policymaking. And finally, there is the collapse of American leadership. We warned the administration through very high echelons. The message got through. If you move the embassy, Jerusalem will be contested, Jerusalem will be divided, Jerusalem will be binational, Jerusalem will not be sustainable, East Jerusalem will be occupied, but it will be hugely consequential. You will disqualify the United States from any role of broker, and that has happened. The American leadership in the Middle East has collapsed. There is no replacement, and Trump leaving is necessary but not sufficient to restore some kind of American role. So I can't give you an answer, is it alive or dead, but I can tell you the following. The question of Israel ending occupation is not whether Israel is going to be a decent society only, or whether we're going to be a likable society. It's whether the Zionist enterprise is going to be the seminal change in Jewish history that it deserves to be, or yet another brief episode in Jewish independence like the First and Second Temple periods, and zealotry had something to do with the loss of the Second Temple. So even if the two-state solution is in grave jeopardy, and it may be dead, I will get up the following morning and pursue that goal because there's no alternative to it. The period that we're living in there is a chasm between the politically impossible and the historically inevitable. And our job is to narrow the gap between the politically possible and the historically inevitable, knowing full well that I may not live to see it. But that does not absolve us from making that effort because the course of Jewish history depends on it. Thank you.
As you can see, asking Danny to consolidate his thoughts on a topic like this to a short statement is nigh on impossible. But as you just stated, the effort must be made. Okay. So Dahlia, if I may turn to you, you're an expert on Israeli public opinion. And so I'd like to ask you how and to what extent you see Israeli public opinion having changed during this period of revolutionary foreign policy by the Trump administration on Israel-Palestine, and to the extent that there have been changes, do you think that they could be reversed?
Great question. Thank you for having me. Thank you for hosting this panel. I want to get to your question, but I just have to say that, following Danny is tough. I'm not going to be nearly as funny, but I'm debating as to whether I am as apocalyptic, more or less, and I haven't decided yet. And the other thing I want to say is, once you read Khaled's book, it makes all this make sense. So everybody should read it. In terms of your question, the easy answer to whether public opinion has changed because of this scorched earth policy is only with regards to Mr. Trump. And it's made him very popular in Israel. He has very high ratings. He basically, Israel is essentially a Republican country in terms of his levels of support. The only people who don't have a net favorable rating for Trump are basically left-wingers and Palestinian citizens of Israel. But that's not really the point. In terms of where people are on the conflict, actually, opinions haven't changed particularly since he took office with relation to the conflict. And if they have, they're taking a long time to kind of work their way through Israeli minds. But so far, I've seen very little evidence of it. What I do see is a lot of continuity with the trends in public opinion that we've been seeing over the course of the last decade. And that very much reinforces something Danny said, which is that most of these policies really aren't new. I mean, what Trump has done has punctuated them. We may even say he's done a service by calling them by their name, in a way, laying them out on the table. I don't like it, but this, the creeping annexation, the realization, the acknowledgement that Israel is de facto the sovereign in Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. Why shouldn't we say these things so we can actually cope with them? In that sense, the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, because I no longer talk about these two populations separately, there's no point. We are together between the river and the sea. We have to start seeing ourselves and our fates as intertwined. The Israeli and Palestinian public has been showing incrementally declining support for the two-state solution over the course of the last decade. So from roughly the end of the first decade of the 2000s, around 2010, we're seeing a slow and incremental decline to from the high point somewhere in the middle of the 2000s of roughly 60 up to close to 70%, just creeping down over the years to the point where in the last joint survey that I did with my colleague Khalil Shikaki, who I'll represent his data here too, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians showed below half, about 43% actually on both sides, who support the two-state solution, and most of the rest are opposed. That's a majority. There is one population between the river and the sea who supports the two-state solution at a very high rate, and that is Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel very consistently. But the two parties that see themselves in conflict, both of them are now below a majority who support it. And that's because people on the ground, you know, the people who are living this, are not really following the ups and downs and vagaries of American politics. They're looking at their lived experiences, they're seeing reality, and they're seeing their political reality. And they're not fools. They know the score. On both sides, they see their politicians are either unwilling or unable to advance the peace process. Many of these people are okay with it, on the Israeli side, of course. But they see the reality in ways that so many outsiders are unable to see or somehow don't want to see. For that reason, this brings me to my next point, which, you know, kind of demonstrates why I don't think public opinion has changed. The number of people in Israel who identify as center, left, and right hasn't changed significantly in about a dozen years. And that self-definition of right, left, or center is based almost entirely, first of all, on attitudes towards the conflict and security. That's evidence of the fact that what Trump has done has really only, you know, ingratiated himself to the Israeli public and made him a friend of Netanyahu's. By the way, it hasn't really saved Netanyahu, right? You'll notice that all these little gifts and presents that he's given to Netanyahu, well, Netanyahu only managed to tie in the April elections and lost 29,000 votes for his party, but actually a potential of 7 seats. He actually went down 7 seats, and we now are in a political mess because Trump hasn't managed to save Netanyahu on this stuff. All this brings us to a situation that doesn't look very good, right? And by the way, when I said right, left, and center, just so we all know the map on the Israeli side, the right wing is about half of the Israeli adult population, and that includes all citizens. If you look just at Jews, it's closer to 60%. The center plus the left combined are about 42 to 45%, so we have greater parity than you may realize. The center is a lot more like the left when it comes to supporting a two-state solution. So that's the map, and I will say that because I argue that security in the conflict is the basic parameter that defines left, right, and center, I can zoom in further and say the two factors that really define and completely break up the Israeli left, right, center map are attitudes towards settlements and support for the two-state solution. Those are the two factors that are a perfect sort of barometer for where people are. Settlements, by the way, completely divide the center. When you talk about the two-state solution, the center is almost consistently majority for a two-state solution. Okay, so just keep those in mind. The question then becomes, really our overall question, is any of this reversible? And I can tell you that as a public opinion researcher, you know, Khalil Shikaki and I do all sorts of experiments about what kinds of policy incentives we can put on the table, how we can tweak the two-state solution, what kind of negotiating tactics might be used, what kind of additional, you know, again, incentives or benefits or better conditions of the two-state solution we can provide to both sides. And if you really ask in just the right way and you cut the numbers just right and you add them all together, the people who might change their minds with the people who might have supported it to begin with, you can barely eke out a majority. But that is a tiny little data drop in a much bigger picture that you would need in order to reach a two-state solution. And that much bigger picture includes updated incentives, a different kind of, you know, plans that include changing policies for the changing realities. It also includes political leadership that's really committed to it. I think that that's the elephant in the room. We can't ever get there without that. It requires some form of mutuality. It requires international support. It requires support from the Arab countries. And in those conditions of perfect storm, it may sort of be reversible. The question is, by then, will anything be left? And when I say will anything be left, I want to break that down into two more factors. One in terms of public interest, already we're seeing what I will talk about maybe in the next round, a sort of something beyond this isn't the highest priority in the surveys. It's beyond that. It's something that I call post-solutionism. I didn't invent that, but I think that we're seeing a new phase of this post-solutionism. It's just not even sort of relevant to the debate. And will anything be left in terms of physical space on the ground for Palestinians to have self-determination? The Jewish community already has self-determination for their nation. Palestinians need it as well, and we need to find the space for it.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. Obviously, given the imperative of support for a two-state solution from the Israeli public, I think that's all very sobering and extremely important for us all to hear. So thank you so much.
I never promised to be uplifting.
Right. Okay, I want to turn to Khaled Elgindy now. Khaled, we've been lavishing praise on your book, and justifiably so. In that book, you detail the long-running pathologies in U.S. policy toward Palestinians. So what I want to ask you is kind of two sets of questions. On the one hand, do you see the policy of the Trump administration toward Palestinians as revolutionary or kind of a continuity of what you document in your book? Do you think that to the extent that you see a new crisis in relations between U.S. and Palestinians, do you think that this will extend beyond the Trump administration? And the second issue I would love for you to address is from the Palestinian perspective, from the perspective of the PLO and the Palestinian leadership. What is the Palestinian strategy at this point? And do you think the Palestinian leadership itself will continue to hold firm to the two-state solution? Please answer this in 30 seconds or less. Just kidding. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you to my friends at J Street for having me with such a brilliant panel. So I was actually going to start from that point in your framing in terms of your reference to the Trump policy as revolutionary. I think in a lot of ways it is, but it also isn't. It's certainly revolutionary in the speed and in the severity of the kinds of things that it has done. But it's not so new in terms of the direction and thrust and basic nature of American policy, which has been more or less, to put it in crude terms, to put your thumb on the scale on the part of on behalf of one party, which also happens to be the stronger party, in this conflict as a mediator. So we've already seen in the past, the groundwork for what Trump has done was already laid, really a lot of it during the heyday of the Oslo process in the 1990s, the Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act, the closure of the PLO mission. These were Oslo-era laws that were passed in the U.S. Congress and were kind of these sort of poison pills that were planted into this policy, just waiting for the right moment to kind of hatch. And I mean, I don't know if I've continued or destroyed the metaphor of the seed, but you get the idea that, I mean, these were the demise of the Oslo process was baked into the process from the very beginning. And it sort of underscores, I think, an important fact that we often don't think of, which is that this whole process was shaped as much by its opponents as it has been by its champions. And so there are great moments like President Clinton rolling up his sleeves and banging heads and sort of cranking out the Clinton parameters and trying to get the parties to sign on. And I do think that was probably the closest that any U.S. president has come to clinching a deal between these two sides, before or since. But we've also seen the role of Congress play a very disruptive role all throughout this process, as well as, let's be honest, members of these various U.S. administrations before Trump came in. So I think it's pretty clear that the Oslo process is dead, but in my view, at least, it really wasn't Trump who killed it. I think it was, this process died on, I mean, there's lots of moments that we can, I guess it's very subjective. When exactly did the process die? I think for all intents and purposes, it was definitively dead under President Obama. And we saw that in 2014 when the negotiations collapsed, but also we saw yet another Gaza war, we saw another cycle of violence in Jerusalem. All of these are connected to the fact that, sort of underscored the fact that the United States was no longer not only capable of working toward conflict resolution, but even the more modest goal of conflict management was also now beyond the capacity of the U.S. as a mediator. So really the peace process was had already ceased to exist. And it's in that vacuum that I think Trump has been able to introduce all of these new approaches or perhaps even more of a more kind of accelerated version of the old approach. In terms of what you did ask about the next administration, or did I, or what?
I asked about the Palestinian strategy.
Yeah. So the Palestinian strategy hasn't. I mean, I think it's safe to say they don't have a strategy currently, because the PLO and then by extension the PA strategy for the past at least 30 years has been to bank exclusively on an American-led peace process. And that I think, on the one hand, the Palestinian public has long ago given up on American mediation. We see that in the polls, certainly going back to the Obama era, if not before. But now I think what Trump has done is clarified it to the point that even President Abbas and his leadership could no longer avoid dealing with this reality that there simply was no hope that the United States was going to deliver the Israelis. I think that hope was already declining. We saw under Obama, when push came to shove, even Obama couldn't deliver on simple things like a settlement freeze, much less bigger issues like Jerusalem. So this leadership is kind of stuck, having banked on an exclusively American-dominated process, and now they're left with this reality of, now that the United States, even they have come to the conclusion that the United States cannot play this role any longer, they've left themselves there is no plan B. And I think to the extent that there is a plan B, it's pretty much let's wait out the clock and hope that a new Democratic administration will be much, much better. My sense is that a new administration would have to do a lot more than simply reverse a lot of these damaging policies. They would need to sort of also make a break with the Clinton, Bush, Obama past of how this Oslo process was managed. And it's not clear yet whether that's possible.
Khaled, thank you so much for that uplifting analysis. All right. I think Khaled has set us up perfectly for our last speaker. But before we get to Ilan, which we will do in seconds, I want to suggest that what we do now, I want to maximize the time for Q&A from the audience. And so I think what I'm going to need to do is forego the prerogative of the chair to ask our panelists questions. I'm going to actually suggest that folks make their way up to the microphone and get in line now, quietly, please, if you don't mind. And we're going to turn to Ilan. Ilan, Khaled set you up perfectly there, right? We heard from Khaled that the peace process was already dead under Obama, right? We heard that the next administration, a Democratic administration, can't just look to reverse but is fundamentally going to have to break with the past under Clinton, Bush, Obama. I'm sure these are things that you are reflecting on. And so I want to hear from you. I want to hear whether you think the Obama administration made mistakes in its approach, and what will a future Democratic administration need to do?
Sure. Well, thank you, and thank you, J Street, for having me, and so much fun to be with this particular group on a panel. It's a very fun, great group. What an honor. So that is exactly a perfect tee up. So the one point where Khaled mentioned how Donald Trump has sort of shattered, the old assumption for the Palestinian Authority and a strategy they've used for 30 years. The one thing where I think maybe we can be optimistic about the impacts that he's had is that I think he's also shattered that for Americans. I mean, it was pretty obvious that, the processes that all of us have worked on over the last 30 years have all failed. And what Donald Trump has done is not just make that clear, for people like me, but he's also made it clear politically. He's opened up space. The fact that he's embraced Netanyahu so strongly and alienated Democrats so much means that, frankly, Democratic presidential candidates are more comfortable coming and talking to J Street than they are going to talk to AIPAC. I mean, he has, that process was happening already, but he has accelerated it in a dramatic way. And in so doing, he's actually opened up political space inside the Democratic Party and in the United States to have a real debate and have a different president who, knock on wood, in 2021 can pursue a different approach. Of course, if he has 4 more years, we could also really see the demolition of all of it. I mean, because I think there will be no plan between now and 2021, but there could be a plan. There could be a rewriting of the parameters then. There could be Donald Trump unleashed in so many ways, including on this issue that all of us need to worry about. But in terms of, I've thought about, some of the lessons, mistakes that we made in the past and how we can change things and what different administrations we asked me to do. So I think the first one, and Khaled started to get to it, is it's not enough, but you do have to, a new administration does need to come in and reverse a number of the steps that the Trump administration did. I really think the focus should be on taking steps that are positive, that move towards a two-state solution, or at least arrest the negative developments on the ground. So restarting aid, reopening the PLO delegation here in Washington, welcoming the general delegation back. I don't think we necessarily need to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv, because I don't think that that's what the Palestinians care nearly as much about. What they do care about hearing is that the U.S. is putting Jerusalem on the table, that we are looking at 2 capitals in Jerusalem, and that is the end that we seek and we support. And we would look, and we're reopening the mission to the Palestinians in Jerusalem, the consulate that was closed, but we look forward to the day when that mission is an embassy to the state of Palestine, and in the capital, in Palestine's capital, in Jerusalem. And I think that that's going to be really important to say. Now, that's not enough. That's just the starting point. I think the next lesson is that, the process of the last 30 years, where the U.S. comes in and you have the Secretary of State or the President running over there every few weeks, trying to do high-level negotiations while completely disregarding what's actually happening on the ground, like, that hasn't worked. And so we need to focus much more on what is happening on the ground and less on these high-level meetings. And the reality is, this issue has dropped in terms of priority for the United States. When the United States looks at the Middle East, it doesn't look at it the way it used to. Israel-Palestine used to be issue number 1. Now maybe it's like 4 or 5. But there's some good news here, in my opinion, because there is no massive breakthrough right now unless we get different leadership and things align perfectly. And so in the meantime, I don't think we need presidents and secretaries of state banging their heads against the wall. I think they need to support their team, and their team needs to be doing very serious work to try to reverse negative trends on the ground. So the other thing I'll say on this is part of when I worked on this issue, Gaza was kind of like an afterthought, and the West Bank was, we're going to get peace between Israelis and Israel and the PLO, and then this Gaza thing will just work itself out. Hamas will have no choice but to come back in. That's been American policy for a while now, and that needs to change. And I think a new administration should come in and put real effort behind both tracks, both the West Bank and Israeli-Palestinian negotiations or leadership and discussions and things that are happening on the West Bank, but also Gaza. And we wrote a long report on this Center for New American Security together with Brookings about a year ago, a task force that Khaled was on along with others that looked at a lot of these questions, and I can go into more detail on what we should do, but I'd like to see a president do that. And finally, maybe this was the biggest failure of the Obama administration. If any of you guys saw Frank Lowenstein this morning, he gives a masterful presentation on how the situation on the ground is deteriorating, but it's also a sort of evidence of our failure. I was part of the team where I worked with Frank very closely, right? I mean, and so we need to think about how we actually deter settlement activity. And it's not the only threat to the two-state solution, but it's the most immediate, it's the most hard to reverse. And so, I'm toying with ideas and how you might do that. I think we need to figure out a policy that actually tries to deal with some of these realities. We have to be able to put consequences on Israel, but we also have to make those consequences real and directed at things that we think actually endanger the two-state solution. And so this is part of the challenge. So, some people say, well, just let them build inside the blocks. Nobody knows what the blocks are, okay? And that's completely defined differently by everybody else. And plus, the blocks doesn't even include what you do about Jerusalem. Okay, then let's use the barrier as the basis. I don't think that's good because, again, that doesn't address the issue inside of Jerusalem. It also, Israel kind of unilaterally built the barrier with specific areas that some of the most contested got put into Israel. Personally, I'm toying around with the idea, so I'll just throw it out there, and my panelists rip me apart because it's not fully baked yet. But maybe the U.S. should put down, as part of this effort, as part of putting down parameters again and reminding everybody something not that dissimilar than click-to parameters, a very clear and specific map of what its view of the two-state solution is. Exactly. It should get international support for that map. That map should include swaps, one for one. It should include the swap areas. It should include how you're going to divide Jerusalem. Leave the old city for separate, but you can do the outstanding neighborhoods, and then base your policy on that, and build international support for that. And by the way, you should say, this is our policy. This is not, if the Israelis and Palestinians want to come to a different agreement, this is not the final map. This is the map upon which we are going to base our policy. We are going to build international support for this map. We're going to try to get it through the UN. That might be impossible. We can at least get the Europeans and maybe the Russians, the quartet. And then we're going to base our policy on this map, which means if Israel builds outside of this map, we will deduct security assistance associated with the costs with that. But only outside of this map. Not trying to deduct security assistance when they build in places that every Israeli pretty much considers, not every, but the overwhelming majority of Israelis consider part of Israel. That's part of the problem we would have. We criticize every settlement the same, and some are going to be swapped. Some are going to be left in Israel. I mean, there's other benefits to this. You can build your public criticism. You can build, whether you support international action at the UN or not around behavior around this map. You can also take the swap areas that are going to be identified as Palestinian. And start to develop those economically and build things out there for a future Palestinian state as a down payment on a two-state solution. You can also look at initiatives for Area C. You can look at a whole bunch of different things. I'm going to finish talking, sir. You don't have to do that to me, and you'll have a chance to ask questions. But there's a lot that you can build based on this policy, and that's just one idea that's out there. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ilan. Okay, so as I suspected, we have a pretty robust line of folks who would like to ask questions. So I think what we will do in the interest of having as many people as possible ask their questions, I'll have 3 of you at a time pose your questions. Again, concise and questions with interrogative words.
First of all, Ilan, I thought you did a fantastic job, and I was just worried you're going to end up like Rachel Maddow and expire before you breathe. Abba Eban said that the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, and I want to ask this question mainly of Khaled, because you mentioned that the closest we ever got was, I think, at Taab in 2001. I remember the Saudi ambassador said it was a betrayal, basically, of the Palestinians for Yasser Arafat to not agree. There were problems with that. Nobody doubts it. we'll never get a deal anywhere near that good. So my question to you is, A, why did Arafat, in your view, reject it? Was he scared of being Sadat? 2, do you wish he had accepted it?
Hi, my name is Ira Weiss. I'm with New Story Leadership. A question to all of you, especially Mr. Elgindy. Given the perfect storm that you've all described that would have to take place for a two-state solution to come into effect, and how unlikely that is from your own descriptions, what do you think is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 decades?
Hi, my name is Joshua Nacht. I'm a student at Columbia with J Street U. Mr. Goldenberg, I appreciated you touching on the international aspects of building support for a two-state solution. One of the other recent trends in Middle Eastern politics has been the Russians playing an increasingly larger role and America becoming less influential. So I'm wondering if we should start to consider other international actors as possible leaders on the two-state solution.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to those 3 questioners. And I'll turn to our panelists, and I'll maybe start with Ilan and come back down this way and just ask all of our panelists to grab onto anything that you'd like to respond to.
Sure. Maybe I'll go with the third question on international roles. I actually agree that we should. I think the U.S. is still pretty essential in this process because of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the history there. But I do think we've had this long history. One of the other lessons is where we go in and just elbow everybody out. And then try to build international support at the very end, including actually in the Camp David process that was referenced before. You know, in the last minute, we're calling up Mubarak and King Hussein and asking him to, or it might have been King Abdullah by then, asking them to support things that they didn't really understand or were not really part of. So I do think we need to spend more time on it. There have been various efforts like the quartet and things like that, but engaging the Russians. I actually think on Gaza, a serious U.S., Egypt, UN effort, for example, where the UN and Egypt have actually done the most work on the ground. Nikolai Mladenov and his team, and also the Egyptians. I mean, they're the ones who actually have the ties on the ground in Gaza. They can negotiate with Hamas. They can actually are doing the aid work. And you combine that with the American external support. That's how you build something like that. And on the other issues, I think the more we should. It's still our responsibility to play a role and be partial leaders. But I also think more openness is good.
Khaled.
On that question of an international role in this process, I think one of the lessons that we learned from the failure of the Oslo process, as early as the year 2000, when violence broke out, when the Camp David summit collapsed and we had violence, I think it was already clear, I think, to a large segment of the international community that an American monopoly over this process was simply not useful. And that was really one of the impetuses for the creation of this mechanism called the Quartet, the UN, EU, Russia, and the United States. There was a recognition that we need to have a multilateral process. There are many stakeholders in the region and outside of the region who can contribute to making this process succeed. The problem with the Quartet, of course, is that it was a fake multilateralism because it was a consensus-based body in which all four had to agree. And that means that there's kind of this lowest common denominator factor in which was usually the United States. It was typically 3 against 1. And so the U.S. essentially would get its way. So any future process, among the other changes, we need certainly a more robust multilateral, genuinely multilateral process that involves regional stakeholders, some of the countries that Ilan mentioned, Jordan, Egypt, the Saudis, perhaps maybe the Turks, maybe, who knows, perhaps there's even a future role for, I'm not going to mention other countries. I'm not going to get myself in trouble. But we need a genuinely multilateral process that involves all the various stakeholders. In terms of the question on the Clinton parameters, one of the lessons that I've learned is that old narratives die very, very hard, and sometimes they just never go away. The reality is, the question was, why did Arafat reject the Clinton parameters? The reality is that Arafat did not reject the Clinton parameters. And I discussed this a little bit in the book. The reality was that both Barak and Arafat gave very similar responses, which the administration interpreted as a yes but, that they accepted the parameters with their own specific reservations. And you see that in the White House, a couple different White House statements as late as January 3rd, 2000, 17 days before Clinton left office. What happened over time is that as the clock was running out, the two sides' responses didn't change, but the administration's understanding of those responses began to change. And at the end of the day, these are very subjective determinations. We might argue that Arafat should have been much more unequivocal since he's the weaker party. He should have known that his yes but would be more likely to be interpreted as a no. And we can quibble over whether it was wise or not, but it's certainly, I think, unfair to say that it was malicious, because at the end of the day, he did essentially what Barak did. He was trying to minimize the kind of risks that he was taking. But, as I said, that narrative comes up in almost every book talk that I've done over the past several months. It always comes up, and it just never dies. But the historical record, the documentary record, I think, tells a different story.
Bad narratives never die. Ilan, you had a quick two-finger, and then we'll move to Dahlia.
Just one two-finger and something that I said and Khaled said about the international role, which is just to also remind ourselves that as much as we want it, at the same time, there's not like a massive group of international countries knocking on the door to get involved in this issue. We also need to just remember there's a lot of cynicism in the past, and it's kind of so we have to internationalize it, but it's tough.
Thank you. With your permission, I'm going to basically leave those two questions because you guys did a great job, and I'm grateful to the person who asked about what will happen, because I intend not to answer that question either. But I will say, I will say it in a different way. What I think is that there are two scenarios. There's what I would broadly call what Netanyahu would like to happen, and what he's been working towards for the last 10 years, and I would say is not impossible in terms of what could happen. And then I will move to what I really wanted to say, which is, lest anybody think that I have lost hope and faith. Not true. I have many things that I think should be done, and I want to leave us with those thoughts. What could happen if Netanyahu in his vision, this is me conjuring his vision, I do not talk to him, I am not his shrink, but I imagine, based on what he's done, that he expects that nobody will really be a game changer here. What has happened will continue to happen. Israel will slowly continue expanding. They don't say we are constructing new settlements. They say we have new neighborhoods. The neighborhoods then break away from the old settlement and become new ones. The population grows. Expansion continues. I think that he also has advanced and deepened previous policies that were essentially intended to fragment and weaken the Palestinian population and political leadership and social infrastructure, leading to completely different trajectories in the hope that Palestinians will find themselves fragmented, having no hope or horizon, and maybe even choose to emigrate. So a combination of Palestinian fragmentation, creeping annexation, a sort of pipe dream of emigration, I think, is Netanyahu's vision for destroying the concept of cohesive Palestinian national self-determination. I don't think that's a necessity, but if something doesn't happen, it's a possibility. And the steps, the vision that I have is made up of a lot of steps right now, because I don't see that there's some great hallelujah awaiting us. It's either the old two-state solution or an updated version. I would say the old two-state solution is old. I mean, it was established nearly 20 years ago now. I think it needs to be constantly updated, growing and adapting to the current realities. We need to look at what's failed, not only in the process. We've talked a lot about what went wrong in the process. We have to consider what might have gone wrong in terms of the policy that was being negotiated. The fact is there were terms of the two-state solution that were not acceptable to the Palestinian side and to the Israeli side, and see how we can not be in that position if the perfect storm comes around again. So I think all of us who care about this should be working on updating those policies all the time. I think we need to continue building and empowering the kinds of networks who make the case. The biggest problem we have in Israel right now, if we talk about this stuff, is people say, why are we having this conversation? For many of them, life is okay. We all understand intuitively, we're all nodding our heads about the need to move forward. It is not obvious to Israelis. For Palestinians, it's very obvious why we need to change course and end the occupation. It's not at all obvious how. Their support for a two-state solution is dropping. Nothing is really rushing in to replace it. The void can lead to, bad things, and I think we need to be constantly making the case. That's one of the reasons we established 972 magazine, which you should all read. I think another thing that we should do is consider the fact that, as Khaled again points out in his book, the two parties are not equal in many ways. One of the major ways they are not equal is that the Palestinian political institutions have been so thoroughly undermined and delegitimized by the Israeli side and the international community that they are not functioning very well. And Palestinian people are suffering as a result of that, and the peace process suffers because of that. And I think that we need to understand that there needs to be deep investment in strengthening those institutions, strengthening the nature of Palestinian democracy before a habit, sets in of an autocracy. I think we owe that. I mean, there's no we. Everybody has to be involved in that. And I think that it's not a matter of proving to the international community, it's not a matter of conditionality, it's for the sake of the Palestinian public to live better and show more legitimacy to the Israeli eyes, but first and foremost, because we want to have neighbors we can live with if there ever is a solution. And the last thing I think we can think about is the whole question of settlement expansion is something that troubles all of us. We should be calling it by its name. It is annexation. It's not just settlement expansion, it is annexation, and it doesn't matter if it's declared de facto a law saying jurisdiction and administration or sovereignty. That's what we should be talking about. This is annexation happening right before our eyes, and if the international community cares about its own norms, which have been a major reason why wars have declined in the post-World War II era, we need to make the case that this is bad not only for Israel and Palestine, but for the entire international system.
I'll try and do this telegraphically. I very much agree with Khaled. I don't believe that Barak and Arafat were close. There was a great deal of reluctance. I don't think any amount of coercion. I think there's a question of ripeness, and it was not there. Nobody is more responsible for perpetuating this legend that Arafat is to blame, and the Palestinians always miss an opportunity than Barak. He caused enormous damage. Now, today, there is nobody in public life exposing and articulating the perils of occupation more than Barak. He's made a historic pivot. I interpret this paper, perhaps over psychologically, analyzing him, as expiation for the damage inflicted. Keep an eye on Barak. It's very interesting. The international community. I have an honor of making amends for a certain amount of plagiarism. Khaled has a quip, which I use. I love it so much that I even attribute it to you. And it is another round of American brokered negotiations is like getting a floppy disk with Windows 95, and no matter how many times you poke it into the USB port of your laptop, it's not going to boot the damn computer. The period of American ownership, monopoly, is over. And I completely agree with Ilan. Look, so many of the international community have walked away from this. The EU is fragmented. The Sunni world is willing to sell the Palestinians down the river. Jerusalem won't let them do it, but they're willing to do it. Even those who pretend to be engaged, there's this retreat into bilateralism. Settlements are illegal. Let's talk about trade. There are very few stalwarts. France, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Holland, Spain, and elements within the Arab world. And I don't build on that. I think the first reaction, if there will be a new president, is from Macron and from Merkel. She will not be around by then. Take it. Run, and there has to be building a new architecture. I think that the idea of breathing life into the quartet, perhaps an expanded quartet, serious engagement of the Arab world, but in order to, it cannot be done on the cheap. It has to display, I would say there are two rules of thumb. Don't look ridiculous. Have a peace conference, you will be the Flat Earth Society. You will be pathetic, but you can't walk away. You have to have a display of seriousness that have consequences on the ground. Do that, and there's a lot that can be accomplished. One last point, and here Dahlia and I go back and agree, this is not the time for post-two-state agnosticism. I am primitive about it. I know I'm primitive about it. This conflict will never reach an agreement until there's an impermeable border that goes slap down the middle of Jerusalem. I know no other way of ending occupation. I can assure you, though, but I know what feeds occupation, what makes it slim, what makes it fat, what can stop it, and what can accelerate it. That's what I do on a daily basis. I can promise you one thing where we do agree. The day that border goes up, inshallah, be'ezrat Hashem, may it please the Lord, that border will begin to unravel. It will begin a new story. And the paradigms that you are looking at, I don't think are possible. I think they're almost inevitable. But my friend Khaled Husseini, the president of the Bank of Palestine, says, we Israelis have to get divorced, if only to get married again the next day.
Can we just split the difference and have a partial divorce?
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. It was a foregone conclusion that a panel with these fantastic panelists on such a topic was going to leave a lot more that could be said and should be said.
But there's one more question that hasn't been asked and needs to be answered.
If I may. I'll let 3 more folks who are at the microphone. I want you to limit your questions to 1 to 2 sentences, and then we're going to have a lightning round, a few sentences from our panelists to close us out. How does that sound? All right, ma'am.
To Khaled, what's the Palestinian plan B? Abbas has tried the high road, nonviolence.
I heard a question. Awesome. Next person.
My question is basically, what made Israeli youth so right-wing, and is there a way to counter that?
Fantastic. Next question.
On the ground, do we know of anything positive quietly happening between people on Gaza and the West Bank to get some kind of coalition?
Great questions. Okay, down this way, Danny, you're first, and let's keep it brief. Okay, so let's see. Questions were, are there positive things that are happening on the ground, West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian Plan B, and Israeli youth right wing? What's going on?
Israeli youth. My 3 daughters got on a bus for the first time when they were in their teens because there were buses blowing up around them. I think that people failed to understand on both sides. Israelis failed to understand how subjugated and humiliated the Palestinians were and how terrorized we were. That is part of it. But it's also part that reality shapes consciousness. Most Israelis only know a world of occupation. I think that the major problem of confronting Israeli society is not support of settlements, it's clinical occupation denial. And we have to live with that. We have to pierce the armor of Israeli denial. On developments on the ground, I can only think of one thing. It is the exhilaration I witnessed on the Palestinian side when they led a popular nonviolent movement in events around the Temple Mount in the summer of 2017. We are witnessing the emergence of a young generation of Palestinian leadership in East Jerusalem and Ramallah, which I consider to be very, very encouraging. We have good neighbors to work with, and that is enormously encouraging. Is it enough? No, but there are openings for give us materials to work with.
I will limit myself to just the question about young people because I think my colleagues are better on the Palestinian political plans. In terms of why Israeli youth became so right-wing, and by the way, Palestinian young people are also more hardline than older people, but it's not quite as consistent and clearly explained, and I have done a lot more research on the Israeli side, so with apologies, I will focus more on that. Why they became so right-wing is a combination of demographics and experience. The demographic has to do with a very, very close connection between how religious Israeli Jews are and how right-wing they are. Religious populations have a higher birth rate, a somewhat higher portion of the younger cohort is religious and therefore more right-wing, but that's only a partial explanation. The other part is experiential. and it's experiences they had growing, people who are now 18 to 34 years old growing up during the Intifada, when the only thing they ever heard about with relation to Palestinians was suicide bombers. And it's also related to experiences they didn't have. They have no memory of a hopeful moment, of a handshake, peace agreement, even if it was dashed afterwards. They don't have that memory. But I'm so glad you asked how it can change, because I happen to have been asking Israeli people exactly that question, talking to people who have changed their minds over the years. And I think that there's no magic bullet. This is the interesting thing. It's not because they went to the army and they saw the occupation. It's not because, they had an epiphany. It's not because they went to India, whatever. Everybody took a different path. But I think the one thread, this is an initial analysis of a number of interviews I've done recently on this topic, for people who changed from right wing to left wing, and most of them were pretty young. A lot of it has to do with just exposure. And I don't necessarily mean exposure to what happens in Hebron. I mean asking questions, meeting different kinds of people, moving out of the communities they grew up in, going around the country, seeing, just having critical thinking tools. I think we underestimate as a really important and hopeful channel towards people seeing the world as it really is. I don't buy the whole post-fact, post-truth era. I think that young people can be exposed to real information, learn, and change their minds.
A couple of sentences from Khaled and Ilan.
Okay, I'm going to limit myself to just the one question also in terms of what is the Palestinian Plan B. Officially, there is no Plan B, at least not on the part of the Palestinian leadership, and I think that's the problem. I suppose unofficially there is emerging perhaps the basis of a future Plan B in terms of younger people are less inclined to accept or even aspire to a two-state solution, and are leaning more and more towards the idea of one person, one vote in one state, even if that state is Israel. So that's a departure from where the Palestinian national movement has been historically. Who knows if that will mature into something more tangible politically, but that is at least the trend line among the post-Oslo generation of Palestinians. But in terms of the why this process failed, I think it's important to point out from the Palestinian perspective, the leadership kind of failed. Their central failure was sort of twofold. The first was to bank exclusively on an American managed or dominated process, and that is that the United States would have trouble delivering Israel, and a failure to recognize that. And the second strategic error is to pursue that course outside of a basic Palestinian national and political consensus. So the idea that one group, however powerful and dominant that group is inside Palestinian politics, could entirely shape the future without a consensus of the other Palestinian political actors, including those adamantly opposed to the Oslo process and perhaps even a two-state solution. That was destined to fail because that allowed these spoilers to have their way with the process. So there will have to be, I think, a reckoning within Palestinian politics, both on the internal front and in terms of what their future strategy is.
Ilan, quick thought.
Sure. Just on the last question on sort of West Bank and Gaza, my sense of the question was coming back together. Very, very hard to make any progress because there are so many different players who are part of it. You got Hamas, you get the Palestinian Authority, who actually wants to squeeze Hamas and break Hamas, and you've got Israel implementing a blockade that's actually also supported by Egypt. Then you've got the Qataris dumping in money and the UN trying to do something and all kinds of different things. You have had moments of progress, at least, such as about a year ago when the Norwegians were able to organize all these different parties together to basically put in an infusion of money and support that, for example, resulted in electricity in Gaza going from 4 hours a day to 8 hours a day. That makes a huge difference. It doesn't make the situation great. We have so much more to do, but I think the bottom line is, those are exactly the types of things we need to be doing more of in the absence of progress elsewhere to at least try to improve the situation.
All right, so the next thing, believe it or not, there's yet another breakout session for you to expand your horizons at 1:30. But before you leave the room, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.